Hello and welcome to the second episode of Scottish Tenants News, the programme that brings you talk and debate and housing policy and scheme life. So I'm here today with Norman Cunningham. So I first met Norman in the Wyndford about 2 years ago. But Norman, you're in the high flats here. Obviously, you've been about a few places, so I just wondered if you could introduce yourself.
Hi, Norman Cunningham. I moved back to Scotland about 3.5 years ago. I'd been living overseas for quite a few years and in and out of Scotland. Majority of the time recently overseas was spent in New Zealand, and I decided to come home. East West, home's best. I got sick of being a foreigner. Particularly got sick of people telling me that if I didn't like it wherever I was, then should fuck off back to where I came from. So I took them at their word, and here I am. So, that's a wee bit about me.
You're a Partick man originally, Norman. Is that right?
That's right. Partick born and bred. Wee street, Russell Street, which is up a picture on the wall there, is where I was brought up. It's used to run between Merlin Street and Vine Street, and it's now Partick Bus Station or Morrison Supermarket. And that whole area of Partick, this is going back to before Partick was classed as the West End. That whole area south of Dumbarton Road, around Merlin Street, bottom of Merlin Street, Beath Street, Castlebank Street, is pretty much, it's all gone. The only thing left really is the Marine Police Office. So yeah, totally gone. What was tenements, pretty run-down tenements, but home to people. There was a community there. People knew each other. There was even a stables for the cart horses, for the old horse and carts. And it's now totally different. Student accommodation, student flats, high rises, supermarket, and I suppose it's what people call progress. But the social housing aspect of it is pretty much gone.
Well, Norman, you're in social housing at the moment, and it's interesting you mentioned high rises because you can't tell from the film. We're on the 22nd floor.
Aye, and I love it. I love it here. If looking out over the top of the recording gear here, we're looking at the west of Glasgow. On a good day, I can see as far as the Erskine Bridge, looking directly at the high-rise flats in Annie's Land. To my left, down here is Kelvinside, Kirklee, Kelvindale, probably some of the most expensive real estate in Scotland. And I like the juxtaposition.
Well, of course, you're in the Wyndford, Norman, and it's interesting you mentioned that the location, the proximity to very high land values, and your house, I gather, it's one that the landlord would like to pull down.
Aye, yeah, we are earmarked for demolition. The 4 blocks of flats here, 6 flats on each landing, 25 landings, 150 flats per block. So 600 flats in total going to be demolished. They want us all out by the end of the year. Who knows where they're going to put us, but that's another story. That's another fight. The whole thing is been sprung on us, and in the midst of a housing crisis, they're knocking down 600 flats. So it doesn't make sense to most of the people living in the flats. But we're doing what we can to oppose the demolition, but who knows where that will get us. It's an ongoing issue in Glasgow. They seem to have something against high-rise flats, probably a hangover, the stigma from the disasters and the failures of the 60s, the high-rise flats that they built and didn't really know what they were doing long term. So the big solution was to knock them all down, and they seem to be carrying on with that. The other side of it that's happened, though, is Wyndford, Maryhill, we're now the new West End. The West End is creeping ever more west, northwest in this case. This is the land that these flats sit on is again prime real estate. So they're proposing to demolish the flats and build. What they say is there'll be some social housing, mostly mid-market rents and private. And so again, the social engineering is essentially what's happening based on increased land values. And the ordinary people like myself, we don't have much say in what's actually happening.
Yeah, so you're describing a situation where the community is being done to rather than determining its own fate. And I mean, I know, Norman, you've been involved in other fights around Maryhill because, as you mentioned, we're kind of in this area is in the crossfire for the West End moving north and west. So, one of you maybe talk about other things that are going on in Maryhill.
Aye, well, I think Nick and I first met based around the valley, the Cunningham Street issues that became apparent 18 months ago. I suppose when we learned that the council had put the parcel of land in Cunningham Street up for sale with their own words, a private housing development, and the land had previously been totally social housing, quite a tight knit community, and that was destroyed in 2007. The land has lain vacant since then. It was earmarked as part of the Glasgow City Council's wonderful transformational regeneration plan. Um, the As the land has sat vacant since 2007, it became basically integrated into the local area as a dog walking place, somewhere for the Wens to play. The land was used for various. It was a bit of green space in the middle of a lot of concrete, basically, and all of a sudden, out of the blue, it was put up for sale for private housing. If you actually stand on the land and look around, you've got the Campsies to the right. You've got on the left. You've got the River Kelvin and the walkway, which is a very nice amenity. And you've got the Forth and Clyde Canal and the Maryhill Walks, and it's it'd be quite a desirable place to live. It's close to Maryhill Road with all the traffic connections or the transport connections, and great place to live. And that's why most of the people in the flats here like living here, because of the convenience. I can walk to the Tesco superstore up the road. You've got the small shops on Maryhill Road. And it's easy to get into the town. I walk down the Kelvin Walkway, 5-10 minutes, and I'm at the Botanic Gardens in the summer. As an older guy, my main form of exercise these days is walking, and there's lots of nice places to walk to. So it's a great place to live, but obviously too nice for scum like that live in the social housing high flats, which are, as I've heard them described, as an eyesore. And it seems to be the high flats. The very nature of them gives everybody the right to have an opinion on them, whether and I don't go around looking at other people's houses and describing them as eyesores or desirable or undesirable or whatever, but other people seem to feel free to make that decision about my house.
Well, of course, I mean, we mentioned Partick there. You got to look at Scotstoun. You have tower blocks that have been built exclusively for private ownership, and very very well heeled people have moved in there. So it's not the nature of the building that determines those kind of social stigmas. And I mean, you mentioned the Forth and Clyde Canal and the River Kelvin. Maryhill used to be called Little Venice because of its glassworks and access to the water. And that, of course, why it's a working class area to begin with. You had all these people who moved here to build the canal and stayed on, like the Botany and named after Botany Bay. But you mentioned that it was the GHA that was trying to take your flats down. When you moved in 3.5 years ago, it wasn't the GHA at the time, was it?
No, that's right, Nick. When I moved in, my landlord was Cube Housing Association, which subsequently have been acquired by, brought under the umbrella of GHA, which is ultimately the Wheatley Group. That process was started a year ago. Well, it was probably started a long time ago behind closed doors in various boardrooms, but the first we got to know about it was approximately a year ago, and we were bombarded with glossy brochure propaganda from GHA about the benefits of Cube joining up with GHA. £50 million would become available for regeneration in the Wyndford, and there was lots of very various proposals that looked on paper to be very attractive. I mean, what scheme couldn't do with 50 million in terms of regeneration? So apparently, at the time, they put around a ballot, and 85% of the people agreed. Now, at that time, there was nothing whatsoever, absolutely nothing mentioned that the demolition of the 4 tower blocks would be part of the regeneration. So we feel that they've been totally sleeked as far as their being upfront about the plans about for this regeneration. Subsequently, we got a letter from GHA, I think, about November time. I can't remember the exact date, saying quite bluntly, "We're going to be demolishing your house, and isn't that wonderful?" My reaction was quite the opposite. So they've sprung this on us. They haven't yet, and it's not been for the want of asking. We've submitted, we formed a wee committee to try and make a collective response to GHA. So we put to them quite a few questions, and one of the main ones is that what's the reason for the demolition? What's your information based on in terms of why you think that the flats need to be demolished? There's nothing to do with Grenfell in terms of cladding. There's no issues there. So they haven't come back to us with any concrete reasons that the demolition is based on. They haven't said exactly because of X, Y, or Z. So it keeps leaving us to keep coming back to this issue of gentrification and social engineering.
Yeah, and I mean, you mentioned the housing crisis to begin with. I mean, obviously the GHA has form on demolition. Most of the 66,000 or so homes that were demolished during the period of mass public housing demolition in the mid-noughties, the GHA was leading that. I think the last time I looked at, it demolished about 36,000 homes. So, GHA and demolition kind of unfortunately have a habit of going together. And we've seen in Glasgow the rise of a housing crisis as a result. But you have other experience to bring to bear on that, Norman, in terms of housing crises.
Aye, well, certainly. I've spent a long time in New Zealand. I can expound on that experience a wee bit in terms of similarities to what's happening in Scotland, in Glasgow particularly. The New Zealand historically has, going back, say, to the welfare state in New Zealand, came about as a result of their experience of the Great Depression in the 30s, etc. And one of the first Labour governments might have even been the first, headed up by a man called Michael Joseph Savage, who's actually highly regarded and revered in New Zealand. He introduced the welfare state. And there's 2 things happened under that. Was one, they started the program of building social housing, which came under the social housing in New Zealand was a central government thing. It was, they had set up a government department called Housing New Zealand, and that was the social housing side of it. The other side of it in New Zealand was that because they did at the time have plenty of land available, which we won't go into where the land came from. Obviously, it was stolen from the indigenous population, the Maoris. But hey, that's another whole other issue. But anyway, the land was made available for people to build their own house or have a house built for them. They were allocated land, and the mortgages were supplied by the government. Very low interest mortgages supplied by the government. So the idea was to get people into home ownership. And they talked about the quarter acre paradise. In New Zealand, a bit of land for building on is called a section. So people would go and buy a section of land and then either themselves or have a builder put a house on that. And the size of the land was quarter acre. And that was deemed enough for a family to have a garden big enough to grow enough vegetables and be self-sufficient to a great extent for food on their wee bit of land. And that was great. That worked wonderfully well for many, many years.
It's a bit like a kind of garden city type model.
Aye, it was around those lines, you know. And so for many, many years, that was seen as quite an equitable way of housing the people. And it was. There was the huge parts of Auckland, particularly the cities, expanded outwards, using up what was previously not so good farmland. So it all worked quite well. But the effect of it was it changed the culture into a home owning culture.
Right.
And over the years, that became the normal life journey for people. You get educated, you leave school, you either go into the trades or whatever, you get a job or you go into further education. But ultimately, the aim of most young Kiwis and young couples was to save a deposit, buy a house, because it was accessible under the government scheme for mortgage. So you bought your own house and you raised your family and lived happily ever after. And that became the culture in New Zealand. The social housing side of it sort of maintained a bit of a parallel with that. But the social housing was seen as for the people who had failed somehow, who had fallen by the wayside or didn't quite manage to be part of the mainstream home ownership side of things. And over the years, the whole culture, if you like, is particularly, things started changing, particularly with the neoliberal government that came in the early 80s, following on copycat of Thatcherism, where it was all about hands-off government and the market will supply and take over, etc., etc. So the if we want to just talk about social housing was seen as not desirable. There was a huge
right from the beginning.
Right,
that is a difference between here and Scotland. Obviously, in the 1970s, 70% of Scots stayed in public housing.
Aye. So in New Zealand, it was always a relatively small percentage of people in social housing. The social housing was grouped, as we would call a scheme. Certain areas became totally social housing. And over the years, they became ghettoized, if you like. It was always catering for the lowest socioeconomic group, etc., and coupled with very low investment. They were a lot of the times they were isolated in terms of transport. New Zealand public transport is pretty shocking anyway. Most people have a car. You need a car to get around. So they were marginalised. Social housing in New Zealand, the people were marginalised. And So what's happened, since the sort of the 80s, that gap has continued to widen between social housing tenants and the private home ownership. And then there came a time when they decided that to make it equitable, the only thing going, well, one of the main things going for it was social housing rents were very, very low, to make them accessible for that group of people. But then with the market reforms and everything, they decided that people in social housing should be paying market rents.
Wow.
And so, which the rents were still less than the private housing market rents, but it was a big increase for a lot of people, which knocked people further into the poverty cycle. So when the majority of your earnings goes to pay rent, then you've got all the associated problems that come with that, and increasing domestic violence, child poverty. A lot of people don't realise that New Zealand's got one of the highest child poverty rates in the world. The last estimate last year was something like 230,000 children in New Zealand living in poverty, where there's not enough income to.
Well, that's interesting, Norman, because I mean, New Zealand, a lot of the discourse in this side of the world anyway, but New Zealand is it's going to be a great place to escape the environmental crisis. You know, the billionaires are moving in there. It's a great place. It's a boat hole. It's a safety net. You know, that doesn't seem to bear out your experience.
Oh no! If you've got money, then that's what you've just said is true. It's a great boat hole because it's remote and it's a bit of a backwater. What happens in the rest of the world takes a wee while to catch up in New Zealand. So, if you've got money, then New Zealand's a great place. If you haven't got money, it's a shite place because it's a tough place to live. Wages, it's a low wage economy. There's a high, just some of the statistics. For example, New Zealand's got the highest rate of teenage suicide in the world. Obviously, what New Zealand has got really good at is marketing itself in terms of tourism, and it's they market themselves as clean, green. They've got huge problems with pollution from dairy cattle and all sorts of things. Rivers full of shit. When I first went to New Zealand back in the 80s, you could virtually swim in any river in New Zealand. Now, most of them are not even wadable. And that's due to the increasing application of fertilizers on the land, which runs off into the rivers. And most of the rivers are not fenced off from cattle, which shit in the rivers. And so you've got all the effluent, etc. New Zealand is not as clean and green as they'd like you to believe. So that coupled with the financial inequalities and the housing inequalities. For example, I did a wee bit of research just to get some facts and figures rather than just talk anecdotally for this interview. So the latest figures I came up with, this is from Statistics New Zealand, government statistics, is that there are something like 69,000 socially rented houses available in New Zealand. There are 29,000 names on the housing register, which is the waiting list for social housing. But where the statistics are manipulated is that those 29,000 people are the names on the register. It's not the number of people in their family. So if we take the average person registered on the waiting list has got a wife and 2 kids, that's 4 times 30,000. That's 120,000 people on the waiting list for houses in New Zealand. I know personally in New Zealand people who are living in friends' garages with their families. I know lots of people who are renting out their garage because you can. So there's lots and lots of people who are, and again, that social economic underclass, if you like, are concentrated in certain areas of the cities in New Zealand. There's also a huge amount of housing or homelessness and housing deprivation in the rural areas in New Zealand, particularly as you go further north, which is moving into the Maori heartlands. There are people living in all sorts of shacks with only candlelight, with no running water, with no sewage, raising families in these conditions. Now, this is none of this is put in the tourist marketing brochures, obviously. And your average person who goes to New Zealand goes and looks at the equivalent of your, I don't know, your Ben Nevis and your fairy pools in Skye. All the equivalents. There's a huge influx of new tourism, people going visit the where the Lord of the Rings was shot and all that sort of stuff. I used to make a point of any tourists I met in New Zealand would be to point them in the direction of these places I've just described and say, go and have a look at that before you fuck off, and take those stories with you back, and go and take some photographs. But I doubt if any of them ever took me up on that.
But you got about a bit, Norman, because you had a bus for a while.
Aye. I had in New Zealand we call it a house bus. There was it's quite a traditional thing, actually. There was a lot of people lived on the road in buses, more so back when I first went to New Zealand in the 80s. I remember seeing this old bus driving past me, or we drove past it, and it had a chimney sticking out of the roof. And I said to my friend at the time, who was a New Zealander, I said to her, why is that bus, a single-decker bus, why is that bus got a chimney? She said, hippies. Lots of hippies at the time, they'd do an old bus and travel around in it. And one of the first things they would do is put a potbelly stove in it. And, of course, the chimney. And that just struck me as being, I don't know, just really appealed to the romantic in me. I just thought that was amazing. First of all, the footloose and fancy free, and the fact that you could actually live in a bus. So when I retired, I bought myself an old bus. I was into fishing at the time. I mean, one of the good things in New Zealand is it's got the best trout fishing in the world. And I'd never been able to, when I was working, I'd never been able to get enough of it. It was very much an occasional weekend. So I indulged myself. I bought an old bus, fitted it out. It was a 1966 Bedford SB3, and I fitted it out as my fishing cabin on wheels. And I towed a wee Suzuki four-wheel drive behind it. So I travelled from the very top of the North Island to the very bottom of the South Island twice in 4 years. And so I've seen a lot of New Zealand. The bus was my base, and my wee four-wheel drive got me off the beaten track and to some really magical trout fishing places and all the rest of it. But it also got me to have a look at some of the places, as I've described, off the beaten track in terms of the poverty that exists in New Zealand.
Well, that's quite interesting on several levels in a sort of Scottish context, because there's obviously this interest more than success, but interest in hutting culture. Obviously the Thousand Huts campaign and the comparative to Norway and much of the rest of the Nordic sphere, where working people often have a holiday home to retreat to. Is there any kind of parallels with that?
Very much so in New Zealand. Again, going back to when I described where the government made it accessible for people to buy their own home or to build their on home on their quarter-acre section. At that time, it was a lot of people. I couldn't give you statistics, but a lot of people owned what they call a batch, or in the South Island they call the equivalent a crib. Now it was basically a hut, usually by water somewhere, either a lake or the coast, the beach, and a lot of people would go off on the weekend to their batch their crib and work away at building it. There was people used to say people worked harder on the weekends than they did during the week, and people would take off with every car had a tow bar and a trailer loaded up with corrugated iron or old windows or whatever, and they go down and work on their batch for the weekend, and use that as their recreational base for. This is before the mass air travel and all the rest of it. So, holidays at home was the big thing. The land at the time was relatively inexpensive. It was within the reach of your average working man, tradesman type people, and the thing is, it was across the culture. So even wealthy people would have a batch type of thing, might be in a bit fancier or a bit posher, but it was very much part of the culture. And subsequently, what's happened is, so that was a great leveler. And back in the days when people would go off to the beach and their batch, and the kids would run free, and quite an idyllic lifestyle. Subsequently, what's happened? There's very few of them left. There's a couple of small hutting communities in the South Island that are under pressure from property developers, with the council putting more and more rules and restrictions on these places so that it becomes untenable. A lot of the private ones around an area I used to live in, Nelson, Marlborough, top of the South Island, there was lots of little batches all around this very big bay. All of them now have been bought up for crazy prices. I mean, they were ridiculous prices. $1 million for a batch, which was just, somebody would have bought a bit of land 30, 40, 50 years ago for $2,000 or $3,000 and sell it for $1 million, which obviously they're happy. And the first thing that would be is the batch would get flattened, and next thing they'd be putting up these $1 million, what would you call them, the McMansions on the beach, and again, totally priced out of the reach of the normal people, from working people, etc., etc. So again, in Nelson, there was one of the biggest caravan parks in the South Island, and that's slowly getting eaten into. That people would have a caravan there or rent the same caravan for 30, 40 years and stay in the families. Those are people are getting squeezed more and more because it's in a very, very highly desirable beachfront situation. So the whole thing of housing is exactly the same as happened is happening around the world. Other places I've been. So essentially, it all revolves around the commodification of housing.
Yeah.
And the New Zealand is a perfect example of what's happening at the extreme end. There is no building of social housing going on. There's a tokenism, I think. There'll be a few here and there to say that we're actually doing something. The existing social housing isn't being invested in. It's becoming ever more expensive. It's becoming ghettoized. And part of my research yesterday, I found that there's thousands and thousands of people have been living for 6 months or more in motel rooms. There's a lot of motels in New Zealand, and the motel owners are reaping $1,000 a week from the government because it's the only emergency housing that is available for people. So you've got families of 2, 3, 4 kids, and mum and dad living in a motel room. There's no laundry laundry facilities is shared between 30 or 40 people. Most motels have one laundry room, and it's normally lightly used because they're designed around people staying 1 or 2 nights in a motel, not 6 months with a family. So these places again are becoming high crime. You put that many people living on top of each other in poverty, and you're bound to get some antisocial behaviour.
Yeah.
So again, a very hidden part of New Zealand's housing crisis, and it's a recognised housing crisis. The government talk about it, but I mean, Jacinda Ardern sent Jacinda, who's seen around the world as being some sort of, as I said, some sort of saint. One of the first things she did was institute a tax inquiry or a tax committee to look at the whole issue of inequalities throughout New Zealand, financial inequalities, the rich getting richer, the housing inequalities, child poverty, the whole lot. And one of the things that they recommended was a capital gains tax. There is no capital gains tax in New Zealand.
Right, right.
Yeah. So that was one of the main recommendations from this big tax review. Jacinda said there will be no capital gains tax so long as I'm Prime Minister.
Well, there you go. I mean, I'm struck by the word that you used there, Norman. Commodification of housing. I mean, obviously, what you were talking about there, the history is you had almost a garden city kind of approach to housing, and many positive things. You know, you mentioned the batches, and the idea that it was sort of a good life available for working people, and then something went wrong, and the commodification crept in, and we're obviously at the heart of this in Maryhill as well. You know, we talked about that at the beginning of the interview, where you sit in an area where, on the index of multiple deprivation, your neighbourhood is at the bottom of the pile, apart from location where it's at the top of the pile. And then all of a sudden there's this massive interest in pulling down social housing and throwing up as many private houses as possible. What do you think can be done to address this commodification? What could have been done?
Well, what could have been done? I really don't have a pat answer to that. I think that there's a lot of what's happened is that people have been convinced that they should aspire to owning property. So, with the rundown of social housing and lack of investment, and we've only got to look at the peripheral housing schemes in Glasgow, which were run down to the point of being uninhabitable. And if you go drive around the drum chapels and Easterhouses and the Castlemilk, you see a lot of vacant, empty land, which were did hold houses, and the houses were so bad that they had to be destroyed. So, in people's minds, to aspire, when I was a kid, living in a slum room and kitchen tenement in Partick, the average person I knew, nobody aspired to own a house. Your aspirations revolved around getting a council house because we were living in private owned slums. Mm-hmm. So if you could get a council house in somewhere like Knightswood, that was like Florida or Hollywood, back in a door with a bit of garden and hot and cold running water. Those were good council houses, and they're still good houses. Yeah. The only problem with Knightswood and places like that is that there's no amenities really. You've got to get a bus to go and get a pint of milk. But that aside, so when the drum chapels and the Easterhouses were built, initially they were seen as a wee step up, until people realised again that there was no amenities and they were out in the wilds and there was nothing but housing, and all of a sudden they didn't know anybody. There was the community was gone. So those places getting run down and lack of investment meant that it became natural for nobody to aspire to live in Drumchapel or Easterhouse or any of the schemes. And generally, social housing became something that was very much a last resort, rather than. So now you've what Thatcher has done with the selling of the council houses and then the market forces, and you're leaving everything to the market, is that plus the availability of cheap credit. So everybody's up to their eyes in debt because they can actually aspire to own a house and get 2 flash cars and all the furniture, etc., all on debt, which in some ways can be seen as progress until people realise that they're just slaves to their jobs and the markets. And as working conditions get squeezed ever more and more, these people paying mortgages and all their credit are getting squeezed more and more, and subsequently we get increased mental health issues and domestic violence and all the rest that goes with it. So solutions, we need to start again.
Well, start again. I mean, obviously, what I would like to see, what this broadcast is aimed at doing is, in a sense, starting again by seeing mass public housing develop properly. If you had, I mean, we've got about 5 minutes left, Norman. If you had any kind of thoughts or reflections on what you would like to see wiping the slate clear, what would you do?
Okay. Well, I think what we came up with for our plan for the valley in Maryhill, the old Kalina Street issue, which we're still in the process of attempting to get a community buyout for that. That's the way forward as far as I can see. So we've had this whole business of top-down thinking, people sitting in boardrooms and council chambers deciding where people live and how they live and what money gets spent on housing and all the rest of it. I think we really need to take it back to a community level, empower communities. If the community, and people don't know how to do this because it's never happened before. So the struggle is to get people to realise that we can be empowered, that we can work to have a community whereby we decide what type of housing we have. We decide what happens within that community. I don't think we should be building just houses. We need to be building community enterprises within that plan. We need to be deciding our future for ourselves. And so that and I worked out roughly that instead of building 300 private houses on that bit of land, we could build 150 really, really good social houses, which were built to a passive house standard, so had very low heating costs for a start, coupled with community enterprises such as greenhouses using a district heating plan that we could water source heat pumps from the River Kelvin and the canal, and actually provide community employment, the profits being ploughed back into the community. So the community could be self-sustaining based on the rents from the housing, the profits from the social enterprises, and providing employment for the people within that community, and training and a future for their kids. So that we need to get back to building communities, let's call them urban villages, within Glasgow, rather than these grandiose plans of which only seem to encompass building hussies, regardless of whether they're good, bad, or otherwise. It's all about hussies. Communities take more than just houses to make a community. And when they knock down the Gorbals, for example, they also knock down the pubs and the shops and the swimming baths and the steamies and everything that goes towards making a community. And we need to go back to that way of looking at what life is like. One of the big things I learned in New Zealand, and which the local people, the Maori people, have clung on to, despite the best efforts of the colonial imperialists, if you like, is their traditional way of life. And that I learned a lot from that. So that's what I see the future.